In this video, we're going to solve a quadratic equation using the quadratic formula. So here's my equation, x squared minus 2x minus 4 equals 0. So I could try to factor. I have no GCF and I have 3 terms. So I would try to use AM to factor. So I'm multiplying to 4. So my options are 1 and 4 or 2 and 2. My signs would be x minus and x plus. And no matter which pair I chose, I would never add to that 2. So that means I can't factor. So I'm going to erase this, and that's why we have the quadratic formula. So the quadratic formula is x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So a quadratic equation is always in the form ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. So once it's set equal to 0, and we're in standard form, it's alphabetical order. So my a is 1, my b is negative 2, and my c is negative 4 here. So I'm going to substitute. I'm first going to just set up all of my blank spaces. And now I'm just going to plug in. So negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2a. And then we're going to work piece by piece. You can't put the whole thing in your calculator. I don't have a plus minus sign, so that should be your first signal that you can't use your calculator to do everything. So here I have a negative and a negative. That makes a positive, plus or minus. And then what I am going to put in my calculator is everything that's underneath the radical. Not the radical itself, but everything else underneath it. So in my calculator, I have negative 2 squared, making sure to use parentheses, minus 4 times 1 times negative 4. And we get 20. Oops. So I have 20 under the radical. And then I have 2 in the denominator. So now I want to simplify that radical 20. So I have 2 plus or minus. I'm going to break it into 2 numbers that multiply to 20. One of them has to be a perfect square. So if you want, you can list out your factors of 20. 1 and 20, 2 and 10, 4 and 5. Neither of these have a perfect square, so it has to be 4 and 5. The reason you want to use a perfect square is because now I know the square root of 4 is 2. So 2 plus or minus 2 radical 5. And now you're going to cover up the radical and divide everything else by a GCF. So they can all be divided by 2. And I have x equals 1 plus or minus radical 5. If you want to put it over 1, you can, but you will just typically see it as 1 plus or minus radical 5. So that's how you solve with the quadratic formula. When can you use the quadratic formula? Always. The quadratic formula will always, 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 always work. It doesn't matter what type of quadratic equation it has. It has to be an x squared though. Okay? As long as there's an x squared, you can use the quadratic formula. When should you use the quadratic formula? If you can't factor, then you must use the quadratic formula. Personal preference, if you just don't like to factor, you could always use it. And my other recommendation is when a is larger than 1, because that's a type of factoring that is very involved and it takes a long time. So it might be quicker to just factor in that case. So anytime I see a greater than 1, I automatically go to the quadratic formula, especially because the formula is given to you and it's just substituting. So let's do one more example. You should remember that your first step is to always set it equal to 0. So I'm going to start by adding 10 to both sides. Remember, if you have like terms, to line them up nice and neatly. So I have 2x squared minus 2x minus 3. So here's a case where I have a greater than 1. I could try to factor, but I don't know if it's going to work. And even if it does, it could take me a while. So I'm going to go right to my quadratic formula. So we should have a equals 2, b equals negative 2, and c equals negative 3. So I'll write the formula up here. But remember, you can always go back in your notes to find it. So I have x equals negative b plus or minus the square root b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So b is negative 2, a is 2, c is negative 3, and a is 2. I have a negative and a negative, which is a positive. I'll come back to my radical part in a second. In my denominator, 2 times 2 should give me 4. So I'm going to go to my calculator. Negative 2 squared minus 4 times 2 times negative 3. So under the radical, I should get 28. Now I need to break down my radical into 2 pieces. 2 plus or minus 2 different radicals. If you need to, list out your factors of 28. 1 and 28, 2 and 14, 4 and 7. Not a perfect square, not a perfect square. I have to use 4 and 7. It becomes 2 plus or minus 2 radical 7 over 4. Cover up your radical, divide everything else by a GCF if there is one. They can all be divided by 2. So I should have x equals 1 plus or minus radical 7 all over 2. Just be aware if it's multiple choice, they may break it up and say x equals 1/2 plus or minus radical 7 over 2. That's an option as well, but if it's free response, you can stop right there. So that's how to solve a quadratic equation using the quadratic formula.